We have our two wonderful speakers today, and we thank them very much for joining us. They're coming to us from two very different academic backgrounds. Dr. Paul O'Keefe is an assistant teaching professor within the School of Arts and Sciences Department of Geography. He is a human geographer and a political ecologist with a focus on development, vulnerability, resilience, and adaptation to climate change. And he's going to be talking to us a little bit about what that is and how that is manifested in East Africa. He also holds a PhD in geography from West Virginia University. Our other speaker is Dr. Michael Conteh. He is a postdoctoral associate at the Rutgers Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice, and he also works closely with the Department of History at Rutgers-Camden. Dr. Conteh is a multidisciplinary scholar whose work focuses on restorative justice and reparative frameworks. He also studies the role that higher education institutions play within society. Dr. Conteh holds a PhD in global affairs from Rutgers University's Graduate School in Newark. So today, Dr. O'Keefe and Dr. Conteh will be discussing what brought them together, despite their very different academic backgrounds, and how this relates to their mutual interest in migration and forced displacement in East Africa. And it is this interest, mutual interest, that ultimately led them to lead the Rutgers-Kenya Study Abroad program in the summer, which introduced students to the conditions that have contributed to the expansion of Kenya's refugee population. So they're going to be discussing that as well. And we'll be finishing up with a preview of where they hope to go next with their research. So with that, I'd like to hand it off to our speakers, and perhaps you could each explain a bit about what made you interested in the refugee experience and how you approach this topic from your different backgrounds.
Hello everyone, and thanks so much for voluntarily joining the Zoom in the middle of the work week, and I see some familiar faces from the trip, which was really good that we're going to talk about. But just a tiny bit of context of me. I'm a geographer. My research was based around trying to understand how climate change would play out in the context of changing rural livelihoods in East Africa. And I trying to understand, in a world where climate change is happening, but how it actually affects people. And that is fascinating and still is. But I'm very kind of familiar with how livelihoods are constructed and in East Africa. And coincidentally, at the exact moment I began to think about how I could pick up some of these research questions, another professor who I don't know if is able to be on the call from Rutgers Newark, Tim Raphael, reached out in 2023 about a possibility of an Africa project, study abroad project he was working on. And that's when I first met Michael, literally at Newark Airport in 2023. So.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to all the participants who have made time to be here, and to Rutgers Global as well. Well, as you've all heard, my name is Michael Conteh, and really, in terms of scholarship, I think we are fortunate to be in an institution that is very multicultural and has one of the most diverse campuses you can find in the United States. And so based on that background, you are exposed to so many different experiences. And a little bit of background about myself. I am born in Sierra Leone, but had to leave Sierra Leone due to the brutal civil war that some of you might have been familiar with, and made Namibia my home. I said I made Namibia my home because I am a Namibian citizen, but I was a refugee in Namibia. And so the refugee experience is not something, it's just not a scholarship, it's an experience. And so, and I approach it from the sense of, humanizing that experience, that it is not just a nomenclature that is ascribed to people being a refugee, but these are human beings who are not a risk to their host nations, but they are at risk themselves, and with opportunities and the right kind of support, they can make significant contribution to where they are, wherever they find themselves. So I jumped at the opportunity when, Tim Raphael spoke to me about, having an immersive experience of student being exposed to refugee, that it's not just seen as a stereotype, refugees, but what are their experiences and what can we learn from them? Because if you begin to go into the literature and the academic debate around it, not all refugees are the same. Some are refugees, some are people who are in need of assistance. And we can talk about that as the conversation progress. So my experience or my interest in this is born in a lived experience as somebody who had to flee conflict and live in another country.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think what you had mentioned with humanizing the experience is something that's very important. And what that brings to mind for me is creating a ladder upwards. And I know higher education and access to higher education is an important part of that. Dr. Conteh, do you think you can maybe elaborate, because I know that this is part of your experience, and as well as you've worked with others. Can you elaborate a bit on the challenges that those in this experience have faced in trying to get access to higher education, and maybe some of the challenges that local universities in East Africa have faced with providing access?
Thank you very much, Carl. That's a very important question. I am an interdisciplinary scholar with development background with specific focus in women, gender, and development. And I do all the masters in criminal justice, global affairs, and a PhD. Now, my work has been interdisciplinary in the sense that it covers a range spectrum of academic discipline. But when you look at the challenges refugees face in terms of migration for universities in Kenya, but not only Kenya and around the globe, one of the fundamental one that jumps at me is resource constraint. And both Kenya and of course Kenya being a developing country is much more the challenge is much more pronounced than what you will find in the US when it comes to resources. And so university face this challenge of where should the funding come from supporting refugees, taking into consideration their competing legitimate local needs that are out there. So with the influx of refugees and it brings constraint to housing, the language support that they would need, and sometimes specialized educational services. Another one that is very pertinent is the cultural integration. Refugees usually come from diverse backgrounds and with significant linguistic, cultural, and educational variances. So universities have to navigate the complex process of how do we support these refugees and how do we integrate, like fostering a very inclusive environment while addressing the discrimination and the bias and the perceptions. I think for most people, when they hear refugee, they see an image of somebody who is in crisis with a bag and coming into a country with a lot of problems. But I want to tell you and really put it out there that is not the case. What you're looking at, who is speaking, was a refugee. But that is a transient experience. I was in a crisis, but I'm not a crisis. So in the same way, refugees can be in a crisis, but if given the right support, they are able to contribute significantly to their host country. The other challenges, Carl, which is what I'll really zero on, is the bureaucratic dimensions in terms of those I can classify as barriers because navigating immigration laws, documentation, access to funding, which I've already mentioned, but especially with the complex statuses and the laws that you face. Some are easily welcome into countries, others are kept away because of the stereotype and the perceptions of what refugees are. And let me make a practical example. If refugee situation occurs in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which we know is a crisis area, they tend to see that as a problem and as a crisis coming through. But that's not the same perception the way we welcome Ukrainians and other parts of the world. So there is this variance and this bias and this discrimination in who have access to country or who's seen as in crisis and that needs help. But the fundamental one, which people don't pay attention to, is the psychological need. Many refugees face trauma. The situations from which refugees are coming from are very traumatic. And coming into an experience where, it calls for mental health sensitivity to be able to deal with this traumatic challenges that might have been faced due to conflict and needs for specialized training as well and support that should be given. But so there needs to be dedicated resources and expertise to be able to navigate all of these kinds of barriers and challenges that comes with the refugee experience and how to be able to integrate within their host countries and access higher education as well.
I appreciate what you're saying too, because I think there's a lot of lessons can be learned for the United States as well with what Dr. O'Keefe is going to be talking about with climate change. And I imagine that we're going to see migration from so many different countries coming to the United States. And that's a good reminder that you said to look at the whole, the needs comprehensively and holistically, and to treat everybody with an open heart, essentially, because they're coming from many different countries. And so are there perhaps any takeaways that you think U.S. institutions should keep in mind, perhaps the challenges that the universities in East Africa already experience, or anything that institutions like Rutgers should be doing?
Well, frankly speaking, I think Rutgers is already doing a lot. And I am of the opinion, if you don't tell well, you don't sell well. And here, I'll use the latitude to really just put it out there what we're doing. I mean, even having this kind of study abroad program, taking students within the context of one of the largest refugee camps in East Africa, in Africa, and in the world. Kakuma refugee camp in the northeastern part of Kenya is part of that process of sensitizing, creating awareness so that students, and I see some of the familiar faces, it was an immersive experience, and I think during discussion, they themselves can speak to the experience. But as an instructor, we were able to co-create and imagine and learn about the refugee experience. So that's one thing that Rutgers is already doing. But also it's creating a pathway to higher education, because I don't want to, bore you with statistics, because sometimes you look at it as just numbers. But if you look at educational barriers at Kakuma camp, you have about 250,000 residents conservatively, and there are about 48,000 students, and you have about 2,500 learners per school. But hear this, 156 learners per classroom, one teacher for every 97 students. 80% of the teachers have no training, 38% without internet, and the average income is about $42. Now, thankfully, you have organizations like Elimisha Kakuma, which is a word for educate in Swahili, that provides a pathway to higher education for refugees from Kakuma camp in Kenya. And we were very fortunate that they hosted us and hosted our students and have a very great conversation and learning experience from this student who have been trained and supported and prepared to be in the United States. And I'm happy to report that as we speak, we have about 8 students who have joined higher education institutes. And that's only they constitute just the 1% of the refugee population that access higher education. So creating that access to higher education is a very fundamental thing that the U.S. can participate in. And so we have the Welcome Corps, which the U.S. through the State Department is also creating an opportunity and a pathway for higher education in United States. We have organizations like Every Campus is a Refuge, ICA, that are providing support and creating the awareness around refugee issues and supporting campuses to understand what it means to host refugees. Because frankly, the perceptions around refugees is sometimes very negative. It seems as an added burden. It seems as people who are coming with challenges and problems that will destabilize. But refugee comes with a lot of international exposure, a lot of culture, a lot of talent. And, talent can be supported and talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. So when you give refugee that opportunity, we see that they impact their local host cities fundamentally. And part of my research as a comparative studies within the community engagement strategies of higher education in the United States, we see that when there is a dedicated leadership and there is that political will and the understanding of the leadership that bringing refugees, they come with sets of talent and skills that can easily be transformed and transferred to the local population. It creates a different kind of outlook from seeing refugees as some people or a group of people as a risk to the community, but can be transformed into people that can make significant contribution to the economy. And I will share certain economic contributions that refugees are making. Predominantly, if you take Buffalo, in way up upstate New York, I have to say it's quite an interesting relocation or resettlement place for refugees. A lot of the refugees from Africa will say, coming from a very tropical climate, it is a rude awakening to be dropped in Buffalo, New York. That is the hub for snow and cold. But refugees have transformed Buffalo into a hub of a cultural city with a lot of market, a lot of booming economy, entrepreneurship. And so these are some of the visible and concrete, tangible experience we see from refugee. And frankly, the US can contribute in that collaborative partnership with organizations that are already working with refugee population, the UNHCR, international NGOs like the International Rescue Committee. All these are things that higher educational institutions in the United States can partner, and I think Rutgers is already doing that. We just need to scale up our engagement.
I think that provides a wonderful transition to the Rutgers-Kenya program. But real quickly, I just want to give Dr. O'Keefe a chance to kind of tee up his background and kind of what brought him.
This is so wonderful. Is a real just empirical example of what I hope to achieve and did, and hopefully will continue. So at the heart of everything research-based I've done is kind of been the question of what makes people vulnerable, where does risk come from, how can people become more resilient? Classic social science, geography, hazards research, sometimes interdisciplinary, but somewhat abstract, trying to turn a wonderful story, like Michael just told, into numbers, into useful data, into useful something that could be, I don't know. And one of the main findings and concerns around climate change and how it will reshape the risks people face is that for some, it may cause them to find their livelihoods unviable and they move off the land or they move. The idea of climate refugees. So I've been really interested in what it may or may not mean to be a climate refugee. But before I could even begin that, this was an opportunity to learn, to humanize a lot of those debates. Very valid criticisms in geography that, a focus on resilience and a focus on vulnerability. And, we're collapsing unique stories, we're collapsing, whole groups into useful buzzwords. And Michael just gave a perfect demonstration of exactly why this story needs to be humanized, just from his perspective. But he also traced it back, both globally to the United States, in the camp, in other places. The role of education throughout this is one of the real guaranteed ways in which success allows you to educational success allows you to navigate this world from even, the unfortunate position of a refugee camp. And the more I, found the stories refugees told me, I had the chance that just to observe what was going on, to observe the incredible work groups like Elamisha, the Refugee-Led Research Hub, and others, Resilience Action, the Open Society University Network. These are all groups that I'll post links to that will be in the slides. And it was what I kind of hoped was this collision of, abstract knowledge about what climate change is going to do to people, what refugees are, where they're going to be. There's going to be more. But actually, these are also stories about people living urban lives in rural areas. They're stories about people living in a place of safety that's also not fully a sanctuary. And there was some incredible human stories. And it was just a privilege. So hopefully, again, I feel we've already talked. And I'm going to draw up some slides soon that show some really nice images. Right? And just, I think, to set the context of these slides, because they're almost all pictures, and they're much prettier than my face and Michael's face. And honestly, I've got some really friendly black boxes on the screen here that I'm really keen. I think just the narrative is we had a wonderful supported trip in 2023 where we first met as faculty, along with a photographer, Julie Winoga, documentary maker, who led a workshop that we'll talk about. And that led directly through the wonderful help of Rutgers Global Study Abroad to the creation of the 2024 trip that some of the students have actually joined today. Can vouch. And through that, I think we'll also continue this discussion of, the way this idea of storytelling at the heart of what it means to be a refugee in the world, but how thinking about what it means to be a refugee in Africa means for refugees in the US and some of the connections that have emerged. And just one more contextualizing statement is the reward of this interdisciplinary work has been phenomenal, and Rutgers Global has enabled that in interdisciplinary work. I know it's often harder at Rutgers to fund stuff across places and make these things happen. There's no other group, I don't know, that could have linked me in New Brunswick with Michael and Tim in Newark. So with that being said, I'm going to pull up what I hope is a nice presentation. And I'm going to go big. So we called it Intersecting Journeys, Study Abroad, Refugees, Rutgers Students, Scholars. So these, just again, the idea of thinking about the relationships between what can be gained engaging Rutgers students with refugee students of a similar age, what Rutgers faculty from different disciplines have learned through engaging with each other, what middle-class white people have learned from being exposed to, what really, a lot of people's conditions of existence are and the amazing stories that come from it. There's lots of stories here, but this is where we're at. And again, I did mention most of these things, but I'm going to just double on all of them. The Center for African Studies, I think, through a very generous donation from the Mad Rose funding, but also a lot of personnel support, a lot of encouraged and introduced me and Professor Tim Raphael and Dr. Conteh. It also subsidized the students visiting in 2024. So none of this would have happened without the Center for African Studies, without Rutgers Global. And the connections that they've made, and both for me pedagogically, personally, and in a way with Rutgers, have been transformed by this. And a huge thanks to the students at Rutgers who took the class, the students who welcomed us warmly at Elamisha and Osen in Kagama Camp, and at the Refugee-Led Research Hub in Nairobi. So these are the thanks. I'm going to throw, I'm a geographer. I'm a geographer who makes terrible maps. It's obviously a Google screenshot that I just dropped in there because I realized I forgot. But Kagama, this is northern Kenya. That's Uganda in the southwest. That's South Sudan above, and Lake Turkana. Kagama is on the A1, the road that goes up to South Sudan, and it's a refugee camp that's about 30, just over years old, and there's over 200,000 people live there. So this is where we went in 2023, right? And in these images, in the bottom right, you see Julie Winoga, who led a photo telling workshop in the camp to the students at Elamisha and other students from Osen. I think this is where we met Christian, who I think is on the call. But as we see such a wonderful picture of Michael here, I'd just like to maybe give him a chance to talk about, this trip that was us engaging in the camp for the first time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. I think picture speaks 1,000 words, and this 2003 trip was a scoping and finding pathways of how to engage and building those partnership. I mean, Kenya is a wonderful country and a very metropolitan city as well, Nairobi. But a lot of the students, actually the two students who, the one on the left with the headphones, he's now at Tufts University. And we visited him, myself and Tim Raphael, last week. And one of the things, his name is Tang, and he's from South Sudan, as you can see. They're very tall. They let me look like a dwarf in the middle of them. But nonetheless, it's always wonderful. He is one of those who are the beneficiaries from Elamisha Kakuma and was prepared by this organization that is doing amazing work for preparing refugee students, finding pathway for them. And Tang, who is now at Tufts University, what he said is very profound. He said, Elamisha Kakuma is not just a program, right? It is a lifeline. It is a chance to learn, grow, and dream beyond the boundaries of our circumstances of refugee. I mean, just seeing him at Tufts and the amazing way he's getting to, acquainted and accustomed to his environment was really heartwarming. And it speaks to the things I'm saying here. How do we humanize this experience of refugee and know that with their talents and skills, they can and will become successful when given the necessary help? Because a lot of these folks, some of them they were born there and parents were born there generations, a refugee camp is supposed to be a very temporary dwelling, but for a lot of this student, it had become their life until a pathway for higher education. So yes, Paul, and we have those wonderful exchange, and of course, wherever Michael is, food will be there. I love to eat, and food is something that we love. So we enjoy some good Ethiopian cuisine when we were there as well. Yeah.
Yes, just one more thanks that wasn't on the list. The man in the top right and the left of the photo there was our officer on this trip, Mike Oyo, who worked with the Open Societies. And just for anyone who's ever got any interest in running a study abroad or doing any, you know the value of someone who knows the landscape. He'd worked in the camp for many years. And it was people like him that gave us the sense we had the capacity, but the kind of the inspirational stories we were given, the privilege to hear on the 2023 trip. What was known as cohort 3 of Elamisha were attending this workshop in the bottom right picture, along with some other students in the camp. And the photographer who led the workshop took one of the few nice pictures of me. That's why I put it on there. But this was such a wonderful place. We had a really inspiring, again, this humanizing of, what's going on in this world, a world where many of these students had grown up or moved as young children or teenagers. That's the world they knew. They were studying, they were voracious for the information, the skills that the photographic workshop offered. But it was also an incredible place. It was hot, it was dry. On the edge of the camp, some older folk were still trying to do some agriculture. But those who'd moved as young kids and didn't have that background, agriculture was completely oblivious to them, yet they were very far out. The picture in the top right there is just, as we were leaving the camp to head, in the town of Lodwar to fly back to Nairobi. It was kind of the moment for me. We thought this would be just great to have students brought out in 20, this is the airport. That's the only traffic there, 4 camels that are about to just go past departures and take over the runway. No one there, but everyone in town knew whose camels they were, and they walked around. But it was such an incredible place. And we were very fortunate to be able to get student interest and support immensely from Rocio and Cara and Becky and everyone else in Study Abroad to get through the planning, the logistics of a trip. And in 2024, we returned about 10 months later. And just a couple of bits to kind of hopefully give evidence of both, having fun. This is Noah, a geography major, from New Brunswick, on the left, having a great time at the giraffe sanctuary, because you learn experientially in many ways. But equally in the photo at the bottom right here, we see a group of Rutgers students and refugees, Dr. Conteh at the back, at the refugee-led research hub, an organization that has space in the British East Africa Institute in Nairobi, where refugees kind of come up with some of their own research questions. They find things that people want research. They find ways of employing refugees. Many within Kenya lack papers to officially work, and this can be an amazing opportunity for some of them. For some people in the camp, this was an opportunity to move to the big city, not this way because they've enrolled in a school. But Michael ran a wonderful workshop on kind of people talking about their experience as refugees, their experience as students at Rutgers, and some of the challenges students have faced in other Manuela, Essence, other Yohangel, Brandon. I see a lot of them on there as well. So I'm going to let Michael speak a little more about the trip and some of what I thought were incredibly successful workshops around telling your own story as a refugee, as a student, as a first generation student, as an immigrant, and I just got to watch it. But I'd like Michael to tell a little bit more about some of the workshops him and Professor Raphael ran in the camp.
Thank you, Paul. And I believe some of the students on the call on the Zoom can also speak to their experience as well during the Q&A. And and have an opportunity to share, because I think their voice also matters and they will be able to give perspective. But just from learning from learning with refugees, one of the first conversations was about telling your story. We all have stories, and it depends on what story we want to tell and what story we are comfortable and are ready to talk about. Now, remember that a lot of the refugee experience can be very traumatic. And so there is a tension between remembering and forgetting. But the process of getting you into resettlement and what, you must constantly be telling your story and in a way traumatizing you. And so it is one of those ways of what story do you tell about your refugee experience. I could recall in a conversation around the small groups, one of the refugees said to me, my name is so and so, I'm just a refugee. I was touched. I said, you're not just a refugee. Because you see, the stories that are told about people, after a while, we internalize those stories and sadly, it becomes our reality. But so we need to begin to unlearn those kind of stories that are told about you and what kind of narrative. So in a way, we need to be changing the narratives and say, this is Michael. This is what I've been able to do despite all my circumstances. This is Steng Makwesh. This is Deng. This is all this. And they're doing amazing work. These are their talents. And so it was very heartwarming, for lack of a better word, to see a Rutgers student engage and talk and learn. That process of humanizing experience and seeing the similitudes and the similarities and differences, and the fact that we are all humans and everybody can become a refugee. As a matter of fact, Paul, in the work he's doing around climate change and the resilience and the vulnerability, it will shock you, but this is the fact. The number one driving force of crisis in the coming generation, in the next decade, is not going to be conflict around that will make refugees. It is going to be climate change, and it's going to cause a lot of internal displacement. So people are going to become displaced within their own countries, and that is going to be a fundamental problem. So to learn about what this refugee experience is, how they are navigating all these challenges, and the very few that make it to higher education is fundamentally important. So for us, it was very important to help them use media, help them use storytelling as a way of telling their stories and seeing a broader picture. And just to address that point you mentioned, I saw on the chat, Asnat, doing this kind of work, I have to say, in as much as Rutgers created the platform, there has to be passion, there have to be that intellectual curiosity, and just being an all-around good human being that cares about others. And that is the thing that has kept myself and Paul and Team Raphael, despite our diverse background, academic differences and disciplines, but it is that underlying curiosity and need to say, we see this people as people and what they're able to do. So people who are engaged in refugee work have got special kind of outlook and perspective to life. So Kenya is abound with a lot of teachers, but to live in the middle of nowhere where Takuma is located in the Turkana County, I mean, absence of adequate compensation for professional career development, prospect of, so even though they are qualified teachers, they don't want to be in a refugee camp. They don't want to be in that part of Kenya. So that's where the disconnect is, Asnat, to your question. So it discourages qualified teacher, and also the geographical location of where it is. It is very hot. The student can tell you, I mean, it is really hot. You need to stay hydrated. And so, and that's not a misnomer. Refugee camps generally are like prison camps. They are in the middle of nowhere. And it's about containment, not to be with the local population. And that has been the kind of model for refugee camp, which in my advocacy needs to change, because these are thriving cities. And so even the kind of facilities and interventions that are going in there should not be looked at as a camp that is temporary, but as a long-term ways that people are navigating and dealing and adapting to their circumstances. Yes, Paul.
I'm going to follow and just pick up on that a tiny bit of my, because it is a place where it's 95 degrees. It stayed in the shade where Brandon's sitting there. It was incredibly hot. I can't share my screen and see chat at the same time. That's a general point. But it was a place that it is hot. It's a place that the world still pretends is temporary, which means buildings are not meant to be improved, which means air conditioning, basic improvements of structures is not encouraged, if allowed at all. It's about the harshest, it's so much worse than, most places' worst case scenarios of, what the weather could be like at its worst. And this is, for me, again, what was just such an inspiration was seeing how, what resilience actually looks in what humanized. How do people create these worlds? And this is specifically now going back to the 2024 trip, and I didn't even try to embed a video. But the moment one of these workshops kind of got going between the Rutgers undergraduates and refugee students who are all of similar ages, the room just exploded in conversation. And people were excited. But as minutes passed, conversations began to coalesce, and in the workshops they were more guided. And without being soppy, seeing that common thread, through striving for, whether it's different goals or thinking about what people want in life, or people chasing an opportunity they're seeing others have had the chance to do. It was really, really good. So again, just some other examples, Nigeli, Castro there, Yohangal, it both in the bottom left are students who, this was a different discussion, I think, on the values the students held and how they inform their day-to-day living. Again, it was just, as a faculty instructor, the kind of the engagement from our students, from the refugee students, just really rejuvenated my sense of, what teaching could do if it, when it goes. And the photo on the right, again, is Dr. Conteh, who obviously everyone wanted to talk to. And just again, the context, which I never quite mentioned, and Michael, again, is Dr. Conteh's photo, modest, of 2023, was that one evening just outside the camp where we were staying in the Cairo Palace, Dr. Conteh became Dr. Conteh. He defended his Rutgers PhD via Zoom and via a really ropey internet connection in the hotel. And in 2023, that really set it in stone. The look on students' faces in the camp, on refugee students, as they heard the story of this person who became a refugee, but became so much more than a refugee over 25 years, and became a doctor at Kakuma. You could see, you could see. And that was cohort 3 of Elamisha. And when we got there in 2024, every single one of that cohort who got a full scholarship to either the US or the United Kingdom, a couple of them went, or Canada. And I'm going to...
I'm sorry, Paul. I just want to go back a little bit on that picture there, because one of the things, as we were talking about values with the two, Anissa and...
Yes, please.
Yes, it's about value and what gives hope, because being in a refugee camp can bring a lot of hopelessness, and a lot of them come from different parts, but one of the things that kept them going was their faith. And Asnat, Rune, and a name escaped me as well, but they engaged me in this conversation of, it's very difficult, being in camps like this, and sometimes, so this was a very deep interfaith dialogue around hope and around how you navigate traumatic experiences and people not understanding you and making fun of you because of your hijab and all the challenges that come with that. But so in circumstances where people face trauma and all these difficulties, for me, it was fascinating to see the role of faith and religion in that setting, how they use that to their advantage to navigate and to create that atmosphere of hope that one day things will be okay. And that was very, very impressive for me.
The hope was, it was real, and it was it really made you, in the best way, check your privilege, check your and Dr. Conteh had a fabulous way of engaging. Just one other tiny bit of context about the camp that we weren't clear about. This has people from all over East Africa, from Somalia, from Ethiopia, from Sudan, from South Sudan, from Congo, from Burundi. It's like a microcosm, but it's a world within the camp that has some violence that has sporadically emerged, but it's a world that's remarkably normal in the most perverse sense, in the most hostile conditions, where people speak of their hopes and dreams. And I got to experience that. I guess we'll have one quick aside before we come back to the Al-Amisha students, because the other bit that really struck me, right, is the idea of, the people who've lived their, most of their formative years, if not their whole life, in this refugee camp. A student there, Manu, from Rutgers, is talking to Mulki, who was a Somali in the top left. And she, again, after arriving in the camp and deciding, that's home, along with two other refugees, formed this great group called Photo Film for Change. And they found some land somehow at the edge of the camp, and they found the resources to build a little building, and they called themselves an art center. And at the heart of what they're doing is the idea that we're in this camp, this is our home, we want to tell our stories, right? So there's these different dynamics. For some, it's about the dream of, what the world can offer if only you can access it. And the number we were always told, 1% of refugees make it to higher education. So even these people with even a shot got so far. Right? But what does it mean to be in these places? What does your memory consist of if it's a refugee camp? What the cultural background of this incredible mixing pot? And these students from different countries, from Burundi, from Darfur in Sudan, and from Somalia, had a dream of, and still have, it's now in progress, of building a stage where they can host performances, theater, of poetry, of whatever people in the camp want to do. And we were able to help support this with a kind of groundbreaking ceremony where we posed, well, I posed for a photo. Others did some work. Brandon was incredible, as were their laborers. And this is the start of excavation for building, what they hope is going to be a performance space. And again, our students engaging with the refugees there, but it was a very different way of, again, thinking what the world could be, thinking what the opportunities are for, and thinking how important, as a geographer, things like place are. But I do want to return to what, for me, was one of the most favorite things I've just ever had the chance to be part of, which was Al-Amisha kindly allowed us to help host their cohort 3's graduation ceremony. So this is the students who had all successfully found scholarships to travel. Incredible organization. As soon as I can access my cursor, I'm going to post links in the chat. But this is now Dr. Conteh in his Rutgers doctoral regalia that he brought along for the trip, with some of the same, you might recognize, students from the 2023 trip. And in the top right, this was their graduation ceremony. And seeing the mothers and the brothers and sisters and the families of these students, and the way the students translated their parents for the room to anyone who needed it, or they translated, and just the celebration. And we ended up there's a couple of Rutgers students, Rutgers Global T-shirt, a couple of cohort 4 from El Amisha, and some other refugees who really got to see, these things are possible. And, to be clear, this is all things we observed. This isn't, our project. It's just a privilege. But at the heart of the graduation ceremony was inspiring for the students and the room speech from Dr. Conteh. So he gave the keynote at their graduation and relayed a lot of the same themes that he's already touched on today, as well as what he shared with individual students. And I think our students really enjoyed it as much as we, the faculty, did. Just a joy. A lovely way to kind of sum up, but also cement relationships going forward. So we celebrated, and I guess I'm going to leave Michael, if you want to say anything more about the trip, and then I'll maybe go to future.
No, I think, Paul, you said it all. Just a footnote to the graduation, because there is significant barrier for accessing education in a place like Kakuma camp. And sometimes, the motivational and existential challenge is like, because of the restricted opportunities, it can feel like an exercise in futility. Why do I go to school and after finishing school, I can't access employment? I can't go to Nairobi. There is a lot of barriers of getting to the city. I can't access higher education, but to see, this was the first graduation El Amisha made. And it was just something that, my eyes don't normally sweat, but my eyes sweated a lot during that day because just to see the mothers and the expectation and the impact, the cascading effect it has on the other cohorts looking at this student, that their destiny is set. They are getting out of the camp. They are going to universities in the US, in Canada, in the UK, made possible by the amazing work that El Amisha Takuma is doing in preparing the student. Was just something I would hold with me for the rest of my life. It was not an easy thing to speak, to just see the eyes and the emotions, and there was translation in French, in Arabic, in Swahili with the folks around their parents, but just to see this 14 students being, knowing that there is a way at the end, it was amazing. And again, Rutgers was part of that experience because it was due to the Rutgers engagement being the first. I think there are 2 footnotes here, Paul. I think we were among one of the first to have a defense ceremony in a refugee setting, and also to be, a keynote at a graduation ceremony for refugee students in the camp, in their setting. So that was impactful even for the Rutgers students who were on the trip as well.
No, it's wonderful. So yeah, I'm gonna skip over because I'd love to pull this screen down and see people and chat. Yeah. But for me, it's just like it's an incredible case study as a geographer, and I'm just fortunate that I have the chance to explore more. I'm fascinated by wider questions of kind of climate change and society and how they play out in places like this. But I was immediately committed. I want this trip to run. I want more Rutgers students to have this incredible kind of connections we've been able to form. I want to help students at El Amisha, at Open Society, and other places. It immediately got me thinking, well, now we need to think about how graduates, students can, if they want to go that way. Or now we need to think about, how we connect, what's happening here with maybe what's happening in the United States. I was not very aware of things like Every Campus a Refuge or Welcome Corps or other really useful organizations that and opportunities that are emerging. And so I'm having a crash course in that world, but also just fascinated, but also like, yeah. So it's exploded a kind of research kind of questions around live that I want to do. But at the heart, I just want to build and sustain on this project in many ways. I'm really fortunate that I've already got plans to go and teach a class, a kind of college level climate, society, refugees mini course I'm working on with some of the students in Elemisha, and I'm really excited if that happens, as that's going to happen. But also it's an intellectual question, but it's also a human question, and I don't know, this just exploded. And I'm going to close it down here. That was the thanks again, which were the same, but I want to get my cursor back. I've thought about this a lot because serendipity is not the right word for kind of what happened to bring all of this together, because so many people put so much effort broadly in the same direction, working towards, goals. And I just, the whole process has been, transformative for me, how I think about what, undergraduate teaching can be, how I think about, truly, it, at the end of the day, how much education can be a tool for transformation, and how we're always learning. So yeah, I don't know if Michael wants to say anything. Or if anyone else, I'm going to post some links in the chat of the groups I have mentioned, and happy to answer.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Yeah.
I would want to know if it's okay if I could talk, or yeah, okay.
Depends. About it. Tell everyone how terrible it was.
Oh no, I'll be very honest. So, hi everyone. My name is Joanne Nolasco. I was one of the students who had the privilege to be part of the 2024 summer refugee experience. And one thing I will most definitely say, it was life-changing. And I mean this in the most sincere way. Initially, I come from a political science and a sociology background, and being able to wake up in the morning during breakfast and have Professor O'Keefe just tell us kind of like of the geopolitical climate and like the different types of tribes and how resources had been lacking and the political tension going on, it really allowed for students both, I think it allowed for the Rutgers students to kind of understand our positionality when we would enter certain rooms. And overall, one of the most impactful things had been the graduation, because my eyes were similar to Professor Michael. They were sweating because I saw a lot of parents there, and the parents demonstrated it was this hope, as well as a hope of, how can I put this into words? It was the students who had graduated from Elemisha demonstrated that it could be done, but it was also like, it wasn't something that them being able to graduate was also something for their families as well, right? It wasn't only for themselves, and it was noticed, right, through all the efforts parents had spoken about and their struggles when they would go up and receive certain awards or their qualifications. Anyone who definitely has an interest in wanting to know what it is to be a refugee, I most definitely think that you should take this opportunity. Learning about refugees is something that you cannot learn from a book, from an interview. It's something that you have to experience. You have to experience eating matoke by the Karkuma camp. You have to experience the very long drives. You have to experience the heat. You have to experience the language barrier. And these are things that you have to experience in order for you to truly gain an understanding that anyone could be a refugee. Anyone, right? Right now, considering the political climate going on and globally, this is something that is, we are not far from it. And so I definitely do, I want to thank everyone for the opportunity, and anyone interested, if you needed a confirmation to go, this was it. And yeah, thank you.
And are you checking in from Berlin, or where are you at the moment?
I am checking in from Berlin. So, I forgot to say, I love to travel. So I have taken opportunity from the Rutgers Global. Thank you. And apart from going to Kenya in the summer, I'm currently studying abroad in Berlin, pursuing my political science degree. And I will say this one thing that I think Professor Professor Michael and Polly would really like. I'm taking this course on migrations and borders and race within Germany. And I wrote this paper on the refugee experience. There's a lot of museums here regarding this internal displacement, with Holocaust and the 2015 migration crisis of Syrians. And when I came to talk about my paper and provide my, not dissertation, but somewhat like of my thesis, I used my Kenya trip as a reference. And I think that that really allowed me to have a broader perspective on what it is to, not only on what it is to be part of a NGO, but also how the United Nations works within these camps and their limitations, right? I think that that was like something that a lot of people had noticed. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, if anyone would like to ask, I think just a couple of thoughts that again, as a few minutes, I feel like presenting. You know, all of the students we met were refugees. That means they crossed a national border. You know, we actually in Africa for years now. There's been far more internal displacement. So this is part of why I find this idea of the climate refugee so fascinating. Is in the context of international humanitarian law, to be a refugee is the good one. It's the either, rather than being internally displaced, where the agents of global humanitarian support can't necessarily reach you. Yet, for many people in the West, the idea of the climate refugee is like that's the bad thing that happens to you. And there's going to be huge amounts of displacement. So, I mean, I think there's fascinating questions about what it will mean to be a refugee in the world going forward. Will it be actually beneficial to people to be able to claim refugee status through climate change? Will it be will we decide, climate refugees are valuable, but climate migrants are less so, in the same way we do it right in the present with, economic migrants versus genuine asylum seekers? And yet in all of this, you could spend a lifetime just trying to understand how people live their lives. And the way, life finds a way, hope finds a way, without denying the structural inequities and the awful events that have led to places. And yeah, so again, just a couple of words on the links, if anyone's interested, that I did put in the chat. Ella Mishra, a wonderful organization. Those Brett and Deirdre at Virginia Tech, and Annika, who's their curriculum program manager, was a title, who jumped on the call. Been wonderfully supportive. The students, just thanks so much for showing us. And like they're really my takeouts. It's just all of a sudden I've had this kind of, I can't let it go now. And it comes back again to this idea of, I don't know, how did I get the chance? But now I don't, want to lose it. And I promise I didn't pay Jahangil to say what you just said, but that's what I hope to achieve from these kind of things. That's all I can, but I really promise I didn't. So yeah, that's all.
Again, Carl, are you there?
I am.
Again, thanks to Annika. I can see Annika. Thanks to Brett and, all this amazing host, Telemisha Kakume, and to the students and all those who I can see Christian as well. Man, this is a dream come true to be able to continue this kind of work. Like I said, for me, it is not a scholarship, it's a way of life and continuing creating awareness. So that we can change the narrative, we can change the perspective, and obviously create a more just world where we humanize people free of racism and all this discrimination on how we treat people who are in crisis and take out the nomenclature of refugee and the perspective and the stereotype that comes with that. But how do we treat people? And if we go by this understanding that everybody can become a refugee and everybody is just by certain geopolitical things or climate change or conflict and all of those things. So we ought to be able to create the awareness. So I am currently working on a paper with migration specialists from CUNY University that will shine a spotlight on these issues around Kakuma refugee camp, what it means, the human rights issues, and the socio-economic perspective. And what does it mean for Kenya, having such a wonderful location and attracting so many refugees? Actually, geopolitically, Kenya is so well located around the East African region that once there is conflict around from Somalia, Burundi, all this, they all flock to Kenya. And what does it mean for that region? So you should be on the lookout for that paper. That one will be coming out soon. So for us, it's a continuous changing narrative and understanding that the refugee experience is a benefit to the host country than a burden.
And I just like one note, which was always through me, I think should have been throughout all the trips I've done there and through my PhD, whether it's known as white saviorism, whether it's an idea about, that you can go to a place and get a sense and, change the world immediately, or that you should be anything other than kind of at the margins, just trying to observe and see. It was so powerful to just, again, not to work with groups who were not about that. It was refugee-led. Again, I tried to post the link, but Mary Mager, who was one of the founders of Elamisha, has got a brilliant TED talk on what it means to be a student. She's doing amazing work fundraising for Elamisha, but she is a refugee from the camp. She was a teacher, as were some of the other founders. Others have worked there. And just, ultimately that lesson that it's this really hard, dedicated, passionate work, day in, day out, that people have put in, has, delivered amazing work. And we were fortunate to contextualize it for our students and provide some engagement. But there's limits with anything like this. And we're not trying to pretend that, we've found something magic, but magic answer. But anyway, that's just my thoughts. And Brett's just shared the link, so thank you very much, Brett.
Yeah.
Good watch.
Before we wrap up, did anyone have any questions or final comments? Not. I just wanted to express a very heartfelt thank you to both Dr. Conteh and Dr. O'Keefe. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. I think I'm so impressed at how you could weave together all of the different dimensions and stories of this experience. And thank you for reminding us that it is about the human experience at the end of the day, and which has to be told through the data and the concepts that Dr. O'Keefe, that you have introduced as well. So thank you very much. Oh, I have one more question, actually.
Oh, no, so this, I'm really happy to chat about that. No, it's more the idea that in a place that's 250,000 people, for some of the students, so the context is in 2023, we took a walk around the Turak, which is the dry riverbed for 11 months of the year that runs through Kakuma camp. And on the edge of the camp, some older men, right, who presumably were farmers rather than who fled, were trying to do agriculture. And I was taken by the fact that the students had no idea about the crops that were being grown. Some of the students, they didn't engage with agriculture. That wasn't part of their schooling. That wasn't part of their background. They'd lived in northern Kenya. And again, Kakuma is on the lands of the Turkana, who are historically pastoralist, nomadic people rather than settled agriculture. It's hot, it's dry, water requires drilling. And that the students, they had no real interest in, learning how they were interested about farming as a thing and what people were growing, but the idea that that would, be the basis of adapting to a warming world in that part of the world, or that would be the basis of a future for them, was, a world of difference from, I'm going to learn how to code and I'm going to go to school and I'm going to make this money, or I'm going to find a way to get to Nairobi, or because frankly, a lot of climate adaptation policies and what they suggest are about how you keep maintaining people's rural livelihoods at the level they are now. And in most other parts of the world, we've seen most of the population, once it starts moving, leave rural areas. So again, will it be climate change that forces people? Will it be, the rapid urbanization that happens as countries, cultures articulate with the global economy we're in? So, but then, I say, and I really hope this, again, the kind of way we've done the talks worked. Because for me, it's this constant going back and forwards between what this means for these big picture questions, how to, without losing what's at the heart of it, which is, how people live and how people can have the capacity to live the best lives they can. And we've had the chance to kind of show people and hopefully help support some of the best organizations trying to do that we've seen. And Rutgers Global's enabled all of it. So for the talk, for everyone in Global Study Abroad, for your head honchos in India or somewhere, I understand. Global is, when it's good, it's Rutgers at its best. And when Rutgers is at its best, it can do really good things. So thank you all. And thanks everyone who's listened today and is still on the call. I really appreciate it.
No, this was very interesting, just listening to your thought on agriculture, because as you said, most of the residents there came from very arid places, that's not part of their culture. And so I'm just wondering if the government has even thought about investing in maybe even irrigation so that they could self-sustain in terms of food, producing their own food.
There is informal, and one of the other interesting things about this part of the world, is it Calabaye? I don't know if it can be confirmed. About 10 miles up the road from Kakuma, there is an integrated settlement whose name I may have just mangled. But at the heart of that is the idea that local people and refugees can be resettled in, an increasingly. So again, is the answer to some of these questions of how people live to be found in those things? Is it to be found outside the camp? Is it to be found in the West? Is it? I'm fascinated. And the agriculture thing, I just found, it was just really apparent that it was a curiosity on the edge of the camp that some people did, rather than, the core of any identity. And many of the students had come from herding backgrounds in South Sudan and pastoralists, so they weren't necessarily farming. And just watching it, the space to play out. It's like these incredible tales. These things are happening in the world right now, and we choose to focus on other things and maybe more media friendly or confrontational. And again, I hope I didn't present a too rosy tinted picture of what are clearly the hard conditions for some of the but it's I say there was still such positivity to be found. And I think just one last thing about Rutgers Global and the support they've done, especially with Palestinian refugees, and finding a way, and all the work behind the scenes that I know went, like the scholarships at incredible amounts. And I just hope that's not a one-off. I hope that's the start of a real commitment that we all have to link refugee issues from the global to the North, Central, and South Jersey.
Just thank you very much, Paul. If I should add a small footnote in terms of how do we bring this all to an end and taking it forward, I think what you have seen is that Rutgers students are very culturally competent as a result of all of this amazing global study abroad program they're doing. Yohanil was in Kenya now, she's in Germany, and it shows in the exposure. And I think what is fundamental to this experience is that only about 51% of refugee-led, 51% of refugee-led organizations have no funding, and they try to find this funding for themselves. So it is a very good way to support the refugee work and engage, because when refugees tell their stories and understand their own problems and challenges, it changes the situation. That is the game changer. So Rutgers should be intentional, especially Rutgers Global. If there's anywhere to pitch for this kind of work that you guys are doing and funding, it's necessary, it's pertinent, it's impactful for the student. And this is something that we can continue to take forward because it does make a difference. And the US government has actually come up with statistics to show, people, the dollar makes the difference. And we now know that refugees and asylum seekers are not taken from the US. They are actually generating $123 billion. This is not any other organization who came up with that number. This is from the US government. So we need to understand that refugees are good for the country. They do make significant contributions that are impactful within the host nation.
I guess the only thing else I'm going to do is just put my Rutgers email in the chat. Anyone doesn't have it and has any questions about the study abroad trip next year, if you're an international worker at Rutgers, honestly, reach out. I'm your friend. As long as you're in the union. And otherwise, I've got to get it once. That was the price of the clean T-shirt. But it was no. I mean, there's a lot of people who've been scared, especially the last week, as international students at Rutgers and or workers, and what it might mean and what changes might mean. If anyone is global are amazing, but we're also, they will give you everything you need to stay. Whatever changes with stuff. But if anyone is interested in, just a loose affiliation of international workers, reach out as well. And that's the only thing I'll ask. Say.
Right. Sounds like we can wrap up. Thank you so much, Carl,
Thank you, Carl,
for taking us through this whole presentation, which was really, really amazing. Thanks to Paul, thanks to Michael. This was very educational. I'm from Kenya, but there's something I learned about the Kakuma camp. Thanks for folks that are joining from Elimisha, Kakuma. That's Nika, Brett, and I don't know if there are any others. And thanks to our students who did an amazing job there and who have joined today, and everybody else who has joined. I know that our Vice President for Global Affairs is here. I just want to thank you for joining. So again, thank you. Whenever we get a chance, we'll bring these interesting topics to our global community, Rutgers community, so that we can learn. Just remember that Jersey Roots, global reach. That's what we try to do. So thanks again. And again, those who have questions can follow up directly with Michael and Paul. And please join us again next time. When you see invitations from us, we are hosting interesting topics. So please join us. Thank you again.